Imagine being stranded in the middle of a vast, unforgiving ocean for 20 long days. You have no food, you have no fresh water. There is nothing but the blinding sun beating down on a tiny, fragile lifeboat, and the slow, agonizing realization that absolutely no one is coming to save you. You look at the hollow, desperate faces of your crewmates. They look back at you. And then, a terrifying thought crosses someone's mind. A thought that violates the most sacred, unspoken rule of human existence. What if someone had to be sacrificed so the rest could live? Today, we are diving deep into the darkest corners of human psychology to test your moral compass. We are going to explore a series of impossible choices, culminating in a shocking true story from 1884 that forced the world to ask one terrifying question. When your survival is on the line, does morality even exist? Let's start with a scenario that will immediately test how your brain handles a crisis. You are the driver of a massive trolley car, hurtling down the tracks at 60 miles an hour. Suddenly, you look ahead and freeze. There are 5 workers on the track, completely oblivious to the danger rushing toward them. You slam your foot on the brakes, but nothing happens. The mechanics have failed. You know with absolute certainty that if this train continues straight, those 5 people will not survive. Panic sets in. You feel entirely helpless until at the very last second, you notice a sidetrack veering off to the right. But there is a catch. There is one single worker standing on that sidetrack. Your steering wheel still works. You have the power to turn the trolley, sacrificing the one worker to spare the 5. If you ask a room full of people what they would do, the vast majority will tell you they would pull the wheel. The logic seems undeniable. It is tragic, but it is better that one person perishes so that 5 can live. But that wasn't the whole story, because human morality is rarely that clean. The math makes sense, but what happens when we change the physical reality of the situation? Let's run the exact same numbers, but change your role. This time, you aren't the driver. You are just an onlooker standing on a bridge overlooking the tracks. You see the runaway trolley car. You see the 5 workers trapped below. The train is about to collide with them, and you feel powerless. But then you notice a very heavy man leaning over the edge of the bridge right next to you. If you were to give him a firm shove, he would fall onto the tracks. His sheer size would be enough to stop the trolley car in its tracks. He would be eliminated, but those 5 workers would walk away unharmed. The math is identical. Trade 1 life to save 5. Yet, if you ask that same room of people if they would push the man, almost everyone violently recoils. They say absolutely not. Suddenly, the principle of the greater good vanishes. Why? Because the act of physically pushing an innocent bystander feels fundamentally wrong, regardless of the consequences. Our brains draw a hard, invisible line between allowing a tragedy to happen and directly causing it with our own hands. And what happened next would shock everyone, because taking this logic to its extreme reveals something terrifying. Imagine you are a brilliant emergency room surgeon. 6 patients are rushed through your doors after a horrific accident. 5 of them have moderate injuries, but 1 is severely crushed. You realize that if you spend your entire day operating on the 1 severely injured patient, the other 5 will slip away. If you focus on saving the 5, the 1 will be lost. Most people agree. You save the 5. But let's twist the scenario one last time. You are a world-class transplant surgeon. You have 5 patients desperately waiting for organs. 1 needs a heart, 1 needs a lung, 1 needs a liver, a kidney, and a pancreas. They are fading fast, and there are no donors in sight. Then, a perfectly healthy man walks into your clinic for a routine checkup. You could sneak in, quietly extract his 5 vital organs, and save your 5 dying patients. The healthy man wouldn't survive the procedure, but 5 families would get their loved ones back. Would you do it? Of course not. It sounds like a horror movie, but mathematically, it is the exact same logic as turning the runaway train. These mind games are fascinating, but the true test happens when the hypothetical becomes a brutal reality. In 1884, a yacht named the Mignonette set sail into the unforgiving waters of the South Atlantic. It was manned by a crew of 4. There was the captain, a seasoned sailor named Dudley, his first mate, Stevens, a sturdy sailor named Brooks, and finally the cabin boy, Richard Parker. Parker was just 17 years old, an orphan with no family to his name, embarking on his very first long voyage at sea. He had taken the job against the advice of his friends, fueled by the youthful ambition that the ocean would make a man out of him. But fate had a much darker plan. Over 1,000 miles from the nearest coast, a rogue wave slammed into the Mignonette. The ship foundered and sank into the abyss, leaving the 4 men clinging to a tiny, drifting lifeboat. They managed to salvage exactly 2 small cans of preserved turnips. They had no fresh water. For the first 3 days, they consumed absolutely nothing. On the 4th day, they split 1 can of turnips. The next day, a stroke of luck, they managed to catch a sea turtle, which kept them going for a short while. But the ocean is a cruel master, and soon, the rations vanished completely. For 8 agonizing days, the 4 men endured absolute starvation. The sun blistered their skin, and the salt air cracked their lips. By the 19th day, the situation had deteriorated beyond human comprehension. The young cabin boy, Richard Parker, was lying in the corner of the small boat, fading fast. In his desperation, he had ignored the warnings of the older men and consumed seawater, which had made him violently ill. As they watched the boy slip away, Captain Dudley broke the silence with a terrifying proposition. He suggested they hold a lottery. He wanted to draw straws to decide who would sacrifice themselves so that the others might have something to consume to survive. Brooks, the sailor, was horrified. He vehemently refused to participate. We don't know if he refused out of a deep moral conviction or simply because he was terrified of drawing the short straw. Because of his refusal, the lottery was abandoned, but the hunger did not stop. On the 20th day, with no rescue ship in sight, the breaking point arrived. Captain Dudley looked out at the empty horizon and made a fatal decision. He turned to Brooks and told him to avert his gaze. He locked eyes with his first mate, Stevens, and gave a silent, grim nod toward the dying boy in the corner. Dudley crawled over to the 17-year-old orphan, offered a brief, quiet prayer to the heavens, and told the boy his time had come. Using a small penknife, the captain took the boy's life. It was a swift, irreversible act of desperation, and what followed crossed the ultimate boundary of human existence. For 4 long days, the 3 remaining men engaged in the ultimate survival taboo, sustaining themselves on what remained of the young cabin boy. And then, as if the universe was playing a cruel joke, salvation appeared. On the 24th day, a German ship finally spotted the drifting lifeboat. The 3 survivors were pulled from the wreckage and brought back to Falmouth, England. But their nightmare was far from over. The authorities immediately arrested them. Brooks, who had initially refused the lottery, turned state's witness. Captain Dudley and Stevens were put on trial for the ultimate crime. The trial captured the attention of the entire world. The men didn't deny what they had done. Their defense was entirely based on the concept of absolute necessity. They stood before the judge and argued the exact same math from our runaway train. It was better that 1 fading life be sacrificed, so that 3 men could return to their wives and children. But the relentless prosecutor wasn't swayed by the tragic circumstances. He looked at the jury and delivered a simple, devastating argument. A fatal act is a fatal act, regardless of how hungry you are. This trial split society in half, sparking a massive philosophical debate that continues to this day. The public in London actually sympathized with the captain. They argued that these men were driven by the primal need to provide for their dependents back home, whereas the cabin boy was an orphan with no one waiting for him. But critics raised a chilling counterpoint. What if the crew had actually gone through with the lottery? If everyone, including the cabin boy, had consented to a fair game of drawing straws, would that have made the outcome morally acceptable? Does a verbal agreement magically transform an unforgivable crime into a noble, voluntary sacrifice? Some argue that true consent would completely exonerate the men. If the boy had offered himself to save the crew, they saw it as heroic. But others firmly believe that society can never allow individuals to take the fate of human life into their own desperate hands. They argued that once you justify the elimination of 1 innocent person for the sake of the majority, you open the door to the darkest atrocities in human history. Ultimately, this harrowing story forces us to confront the very foundation of how we make decisions. It exposes the eternal clash between 2 massive ways of thinking. On one side, you have the philosophy of utilitarianism, championed by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham. It tells us that we are governed by pleasure and pain, and that the only true justice is maximizing the overall happiness for the greatest number of people. It is the logic of turning the trolley to save the five. On the other side, you have categorical morality, driven by philosophers like Immanuel Kant. This mindset insists that certain acts are just intrinsically, absolutely wrong, regardless of the consequences. It tells us that human beings are not tools to be harvested, pushed off bridges, or consumed in lifeboats, no matter how dire the math looks. The sheer restlessness of human reason comes from the fact that we use both of these conflicting frameworks every single day of our lives. The story of the mignonette proves that when the lights go out and the hunger sets in, the line between right and wrong isn't just blurred, it disappears completely.